My name is Brady Goettl. I'm officially about 6 months now into this new position, and I think this is a really well-timed presentation because a majority of the phone calls I was getting from growers throughout the state early this spring into midsummer were relating to some issues that they had with soybeans. So over the next 25 or so minutes, I want to cover some of those gleanings that I gained from the 2024 growing season that were happening to our soybeans in North Dakota, chat a little bit about fertilizing soybeans, so some of the approaches and recommendations we have in the state, and then lastly wrap up with a question that I've been toying back and forth with and having a lot of conversations with folks across the state is as soybeans move west, as they're growing more, the slide that Mickey had showed about continued growing production of soybeans, where does tillage fit within that soybeans when they're in the rotation as well? What are some challenges and opportunities we have there? So throughout the 2024 growing season, a lot of those phone calls started out with, my beans are turning yellow. What's wrong with them? And a lot of those reports really came from East Central North Dakota. And of course, that's kind of the hot spot of soybean growth in the state. But it seemed that there was an above average number of issues occurring in that region as well. And what was really behind that? IDC continues to be a major issue in the state. Was it disease? Is it something else? And at the end of the day, there was a lot of different things at play. And I want to cover some of those things that were causing our beans to turn yellow this year. So this photo should, for better or worse, be familiar to quite a few of you folks. So this is a very common issue we have, especially in far eastern North Dakota, iron deficiency chlorosis. So this is inherent of the region we have for some reasons I'll go into here a little bit. So IDC overall occurs in highly calcareous, so high pH soils. So fortunately, in eastern North Dakota, we generally don't have to worry about liming. Acid soils aren't an issue. But when we're growing soybeans, that calcareous high pH soil actually leads to this iron IDC issue. We also commonly see IDC noted in the spring. So this year was a little bit different. We had kind of a late onset IDC. So that's what threw quite a few people off is the beans looked good at the beginning and then started to suffer from IDC a little bit later than that normally occurs. Why do we see it occurring in the spring? Well, IDC is caused by the high pH soils, but it's really exacerbated by wet soil conditions, high nitrate conditions, and high EC. And, in the spring is when generally we're suffering from wet soils and then having that high nitrate level, which in some cases is a good thing when we're going into our soybean year. That's not necessarily a good thing, and also maybe not the best use of that fertility that we have in the soil from nitrate. So if you have a soil with high nitrate, potentially maybe looking at other rotational crops to take advantage of that nitrate, which the soybeans don't necessarily need. The obvious factor when we're trying to diagnose IDC is that interveinal yellowing on the top upper leaf. So it's a very, very vivid disorder. So why do we have IDC in the first place? Why is that calcareous basic soils an issue? So it really goes back to a quick chemistry lesson. So in the soil, we have a lot of iron in North Dakota. About 5% of our soil by weight is iron, but it's all in this Fe3 plus oxidized form. And unfortunately, Fe3 plus is incredibly insoluble. On the other hand of things, Fe2 plus, the reduced form of iron, is very, very soluble. And that's the form that the plants need to take up. So we have a lot of iron. Unfortunately, the plants really can't get to it very easily. Soybean, which requires a significant amount of iron, has developed a approach we could call where the roots will actually secrete compounds in order to decrease the soil pH, which then allows for an enzyme to actively convert that Fe3 plus over to Fe2 plus, which the plant can then take up. Unfortunately, in strongly basic soils, the plants are having to secrete more and more of that acid to overcome that basic condition, which eventually just starts to weaken the plant it's not able to take up as much of that iron as it needs to, and then starts to open that door to the IDC symptoms that we see out in the field. So what can we do to try to prevent or reduce IDC in North Dakota? The first and best approach is just field selection. So find fields that have potentially lower carbonates or neutral to slightly acid soils. So on incredibly basic soils, something with high pH, we're really going to have to use other strategies then to try to overcome that. Areas of fields that have saline or salty areas in it, we'll want to try to avoid those for soybean production, potentially looking at ways to remediate that. Also favorable drainage. So taking advantage of different drainage approaches to try to prevent that wet soil in the spring is going to reduce IDC symptoms. And then also choosing fields that have low residual nitrate. Like I mentioned before, soybeans can't necessarily take advantage of that nitrate that's in the soil. So maybe if we have very high levels, looking at planting an end-demanding crop there economically is going to allow us to take advantage of that nitrate in addition to preventing IDC from occurring potentially and then leading to that yield reduction on the soybean if we were to grow in that particular field. And then lastly, taking advantage of IDC tolerant varieties. So the NDSU Soybean Variety Trial Guide does a really good job at rating the IDC symptoms of various cultivars. So choosing ones that have a strong resistance to that is going to be in the favor. The other strategy we can look at using to reduce IDC is the use of chelated iron. So chelated iron is pretty much an iron form that doesn't have to go through that Fe2 plus, Fe3 plus transformation. It's in an available form. It's protected so that the chelate portion of it. And an example of this would be soy green. So applying that in furrow at planting can help reduce IDC symptoms. Additionally, there's a pool of literature out there that recommends increased planting density of the soybeans. So within the row, if we have a higher plant density, so think about widening out the rows, now the plants within those rows are closer to each other. And the school of thought behind that is as you have plants closer together, the roots are closer together and can take advantage of their neighbors essentially as they're starting to release those acids to try to overcome the basic conditions. And then lastly, planting a spring nurse crop or cover crop. So oats, for example, have been researched quite a bit here at NDSU, seeded at the time of planting, terminated with that post-emergence herbicide. And those cover crops essentially are going to help reduce the nitrate levels and reduce the amount of water early in the season that the soybeans would be having to deal with. But at the end of the day, there's no silver bullet to preventing IDC. So a comprehensive approach is necessary. Using a few of those different tools that I mentioned is going to help reduce our risk overall. So here's another example of some yellow beans that I noted this year, and Jeff Stockler was with me as we made this field call. He actually noted quite a bit of this up in his area. And in this particular field, all the yellowing was occurring in strips, as you can see looking from the front to the background of this picture. And it was occurring mostly on side hills. Now, what was unique about this is the symptoms we see here are pretty textbook potassium deficiencies, but it was occurring later in the season again, which made it kind of unusual from what we'd expect. Generally, we're going to see that early season, lower leaves. This was occurring later season on the upper leaves. But to help diagnose this, we took advantage of plant tissue testing. So it's a good diagnostic tool to help compare good and bad parts of the field. And as you can see here, our potassium in the plant tissues was incredibly low in the deficient category. So about a third of a percent compared to 1.7 to 2.5, which we would consider sufficient. Backing this up again with soil test data, again, the potassium in that field was about 77 parts per million, quite a bit lower than our recommended levels. And also of note here is the chloride. So in a 0 to 6 inch sample, the chloride was about a pound per acre, which is quite a bit lower than what soybeans need to thrive, essentially. So looking at our recommendations for North Dakota, our critical level for potassium is between 150 and 200 parts per million. And I'll talk about why that range occurs here in a little bit. But that level essentially means anything below that critical point, we can expect that we're not reaching our full yield potential. So at 77 parts per million, not only are we seeing deficiency symptoms as a result of that, but also we're limiting our potential yield on those soybeans as well. And then chloride also should be in that 40 pound per acre range, and we were at 1 in this particular field. So this could simply be solved by an application of potash. It'll provide both the potassium and the chloride we need. But why did this occur in the first place? And I think reasons are common not only on this particular field, but throughout North Dakota. And no potassium had been applied in about 8+ years on this field. And historically, this wasn't an issue. We didn't have incredibly high K demanded crops, but as soybeans continue to move into some of these areas, they're grown at a higher rate. Generally, people think of soybeans as a scavenging crop. We don't necessarily have to put a lot of inputs into them, which is true early on until we're growing them quite a bit into rotation. And years of thinking that we don't have to put anything on soybeans is starting to deplete, especially those potassium levels. So definitely taking soil tests and staying on top of that is going to be good for soybean production in general, and then also other crops in the rotation. The reason we saw it on this field particularly on the hillsides is, those are historically eroded parts of the field. Inherent fertility was a little bit lower. The reason I bring this up is this is a really good opportunity for zone sampling. So if you were able to separate out those side hills from the lower areas, potentially doing that, looking at historical yields or that soil test data, that can be a way that we can separate the field up a little bit, apply the fertility where it's most needed, potentially do lower rates where it's not needed quite as much, and in the end, striving towards better efficiency and just overall more economically favorable fertilizer application. Put that fertility where it's needed. And then something also to think about as we move into soybean production in western parts of the state that are predominantly no-till, we were seeing quite uneven stripping across the field. And that was actually coming from that uneven residue spreading. So the soybean straw that was coming out of the back of the combine, it's small, it's usually pretty light. We can't spread that the full width of the header. So we're actually starting to create enriched and potentially deficient areas in that field. So as soybeans are more widely grown, ensuring that residue spreading in no-till systems is going to help provide some form of uniformity across the field. So I mentioned before that it's commonly talked about that soybeans are a scavenging crop. They don't require a lot of inputs. But when we look at the average yield of North Dakota across the entire state at about 35.5 bushels per acre, from that, we're removing about 55 pounds per acre of potassium, about 30 pounds per acre of phosphorus with every crop. And, continually growing soybeans year after year, obviously we're going to start to deplete those levels. So at some point, that's going to have to be returned to the field. And again, doing it in small increments every year is going to be more economical than, as that field I mentioned before, where now all of a sudden it's going to take several years of very high K applications to bring us back to those levels. So as I always say, soil sampling, it makes dollars and cents. Staying ahead of that curve, keeping our fertility levels where they need to be, is also going to open that opportunity for, if we have a potentially stricter economic year, if we have high levels of fertility, we can maybe forego the application that particular year. But doing that continually isn't going to give us the opportunity to potentially reduce fertilizer applications in a tight year. So what do our fertilizer application recommendations look like in North Dakota? So for soybeans, the two biggest nutrients we have to look at are phosphorus and potassium. They're quite simple for the state, again, based on those soil test values. So the Olson soil test phosphorus for soybean. Generally, we don't have a strong response of phosphorus application to soybeans, so it's pretty minimal the amount we have to apply, but still we want to try to keep that soil within that optimum range. Potassium, on the other hand, we have fairly high response to potassium in soybeans. And you can also see that the recommendations are split. So there's two categories, and that's based on where you're at in the state. So depending on the clay mineralogy you have in your particular area, so in the gray parts of North Dakota, that would what we would consider a high smectite to elite ratio, which means you would have a higher application rate necessary in order to meet that critical level. So those gray areas, our critical level is 200 parts per million. In the white areas, we're at 150 parts per million. And for reasons I don't have time to go into here, just the clay mineralogy of those particular regions makes it slightly more difficult for plants to access soil potassium. So we have to have a higher amount of it in the soil. The other major nutrient we have to look at in soybeans is sulfur. Unfortunately, in North Dakota, our sulfur soil test is unpredictable. It's not strongly correlated to plant response, and that kind of feeds into some of the salt issues and gypsum issues that we have in the state, which kind of throws off the test a little bit. So our recommendation is fairly simple, applying 10 pounds of sulfate sulfur on deficiency prone fields. So we want to make sure that's in the sulfate form. So that's plant available sulfur. Elemental sulfur needs to go through transformations before the plant can use it. And the time scale that that occurs on isn't necessarily going to make it predictably available to the plant that first growing season. So using a sulfate form, whether that be, 40 pounds of ammonium sulfate or about 60 pounds of gypsum, that's going to ensure that sulfate is available during that growing season. In those deficiency prone fields, we need to look at our less than 2% organic matter, so we're not gaining sulfate from that organic matter breakdown. Fields with coarse sandy texture, so the sulfate would be leaving through similar leaching processes as nitrogen. And then in years where we have above ground precipitation on fields with those two other characteristics, we're really going to want to look at putting that 10 pounds of sulfate sulfur down to prevent potential deficiencies. Moving on to the last part of my presentation, that to till or not to till, is it needed in soybean systems? And a few things we have to think about when considering this is soybean residue is fragile. It can be easily destroyed by tillage, and that can be thought of as both a good thing and a bad thing. So on the good side of things, tillage doesn't necessarily have to be as aggressive to size and mix in that residue as some of the other crops. On the bad side of things, that residue is actually, what's helping us prevent erosion on the field. So it takes very little then to disturb that residue so that it's no longer providing that erosion protection that we need. Also, soybean residue has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, which essentially means that it's going to very rapidly decompose. Microbes are going to take care of that residue quite quickly compared to other crop residues. So in the end, if we were to boil all this down, the best recommendation for tilling after soybeans would be to wait until spring. So try to leave that residue in place. Maybe if you have a little bit of height on some of that stubble that may catch a little bit of snow, granted we're only about an inch off the ground, but that's better than a bare flat field. And if you do till in the fall, from an erosion standpoint, keeping that field as rough as you can is going to help prevent some of that soil from moving off the field. So think, large clods, ridges, that type of thing is going to prevent soil from moving compared to a tilled, very flat field, which is going to open the door to quite a bit of erosion. So looking at tillage from a yield standpoint, a lot of this data came from the Upper Midwest Tillage Guide, which I believe is going to be included in your handouts at the end of this webinar. And I encourage you to check this out. This is a really good resource put out by my colleagues in Minnesota. So looking at a couple of the studies that they included in there, so this was a study carried out by Clarksfield, Minnesota, so that's kind of southwest part of the state, where they looked at 4 different tillage regimes in a corn and soybean rotation. So strip till, vertical till, chisel plow with the vertical till, so chisel plow the corn ear, vertical till the soybean ear, and then disc grip chisel plow. And essentially what I want to highlight here is, regardless of how aggressive the tillage was, they were seeing similar yields across corn the following year. So this would be how you would handle your soybean stubble and then what it would give you for corn yield next year. And at the end of the day, we weren't seeing any difference based on how aggressive that tillage was. What they did see a difference in though is cost per acre. So as we move to more aggressive tillage, so the disc ripper, the chisel plow, it's costing quite a bit more than if we were to do a strip till, even though at the end of the day, our outcomes for yield were about the same. So a couple more studies. This one was carried out in both North Dakota and Minnesota up by Fergus Falls for multiple years. So this shows both the soybean yields on the left side, the corn yields on the right side for corn yield rotation. And again, if we were strip tilling versus vertical till versus chisel plow, as long as the tillage was happening, we really didn't see any significant differences in yield. So if we move to less aggressive tillage practices, strip till that leaves some residue on the surface, we can prevent erosion, prevent that expensive fertilizer from leaving the field in erosion, and still get very similar yield outcomes in a corn soybean rotation. So the last piece here that I want to talk about is another study that was carried out in Fargo, Carrington, Prosper, and Moorhead. And this one brought no-till into the equation. So again, this was soybeans following corn. And at the majority of the sites, we really didn't see a yield difference either in that soybean crop. So this is a good indication that soybeans can overcome a lot of the struggles, we could call them, when moving to no-till. So we can have an increased amount of residue. We can, and as of this study, not see an issue with soybean yield by not tilling. So this is a really good example that was included again from the Midwest Tillage Guide, looking at the likelihood of yield response due to tillage method. So of the 17 different site years within this study, 76% of the time, tillage, be it chisel plow, no-till, or strip till, didn't show any difference in the outcome of that yield. The rest of the time, when there was a yield difference between the three treatments, strip till 18% of the time caused higher yield outcomes than all of the other tillage treatments, and in 6% of the time, chisel plow had higher outcomes than all the other treatments. So at 6% of the time with a chisel plow, you have to think how much more expensive that is than all of the other tillage approaches. And at 6% of the time, we're not necessarily seeing a positive economic outcome from that. So just to wrap things up, this was a quote from, again, that Midwest Tillage Guide, which compiles a lot of different studies from our region. And what Jody DeYoung-Hughes, who put this together, said at the end, even with the higher residue levels, Minnesota and North Dakota research data shows yields remain similar in a corn and soybean rotation, regardless of tillage method. So we can help improve long-term field sustainability by not losing our soil and still get similar yield outcomes when using some of these approaches. So with that, that brings me right to my 24-minute time point. So I'm glad that I'm on time. And with that, I will turn it back over to the moderators.